It's my honor to introduce the person who will deliver the Carl F. H. Henry Lecture. Makoto Fujimura, the director of the Culture Care Initiative at Fuller Seminary, is an artist, writer, and speaker recognized worldwide as a cultural shaper. A presidential appointee to the National Council on the Arts from 2003 to 2009. He served as an international advocate for the arts, speaking with decision makers, advising governmental policies on the arts. In 2014, the AAR, the American Academy of Religion, named him as its 2014 Religion and the Arts Award recipient. His work has been exhibited at galleries around the world, including Dillon Gallery in New York, Sato Museum in Tokyo, the Contemporary Museum of Tokyo, Tokyo National University of Fine Arts, and more recently at the Waterfall Mansion Gallery in New York, the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., and the Ticotin Museum in Israel. The author of Culture Care and Silence and Beauty. He has lectured at numerous conferences, universities, museums, including the Aspen Institute, Yale, Princeton, Sato Museum, Phoenix Art Museum. He founded the International Arts Movement in 1992, and in celebration of the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible, Crossroad Publishing commissioned and published the Four Holy Gospels, featuring his illuminations of the sacred text. Many of us here at Baylor know his powerful work in representing T.S. Eliot's four quartets. His alma mater, Bucknell University, honored him with the Outstanding Alumni Award in 2012. He now serves on its Board of Trustees. It has been my great hope over the last few years that we would have opportunity to bring Mako to Baylor for a conference. And when we began to think about those who we wanted to be a part of this conversation, and also one probably especially attuned to say the final word on these matters, at least for us at this conference, we thought no one would be finer than him. So please join me in welcoming Mako Fujimura.
So before I start, I want to encourage you to visit the Audubon show, which is at the Modern Gallery, which I exhibited a while back. And I was just there. It is just fantastic. Such high level of integration happening. I want to congratulate Baylor University for thinking this way, to bring all of the disciplines together. And if you have to go to the airport, go see this show. Just ignore me and go there. The slide that is shown here is a large work called Silence, Kairos. It was shown in New York Waterfall Mansions several years ago while I was working on my book, Silence and Beauty. And being a special advisor, also, I was honored to be invited by Martin Scorsese to help with the film Silence, which came out several years ago. And so I've done series on silence recently. And I use traditional Japanese materials. I'm using 17th century materials to paint large scale contemporary works. I don't like to use the word abstract, but people call it that, abstraction. I like to think of what I do as essentiation. The topic of my focus today is on Emily Dickinson, Rachel Carson, and the New Creation. Interesting, a visual artist coming to present at this conference, Stewardship of Creation, talking about two writers, American writers. But I find them to be extraordinarily inspiring as a visual artist, and as I go along, I think you'll see why. The great American poet, Wallace Stevens, stated, true religious force in the world is not the church, but the world itself. The mysterious calling of nature and our responses. The priest in me worship one God at one shrine, the poet another God at another shrine. The priest worshiped mercy and love, the poet beauty and might. This dichotomy of the two shrines that Wallace Stevens noticed in himself captures well the modern struggle between art and religion, or perhaps more accurately, nature and religion. In that struggle, art can navigate the two paths, or may be forced to vacillate between the two. This split, though, makes it difficult to speak of creation care or environmental care in a utility-driven, pragmatic world. And even in the academic discourse, like Stevens, we struggle to capture where God is located in our modern times. So how are we to navigate the divided terrains? These are macro shots of my work. It's very hard to reproduce my work in PowerPoint. So I had my friend Stephen Proctor come and take photos of my work so they translate well into these contexts. And you see that now and then in my presentation. Is there a path that will bring us nearer to seeing God, both in religious tradition and nature together? Can this God of the Bible, who created all there is, and this God, the poet, who sang creation into being, give us guidance to lead us into our common task of caring for creation? What I call culture care naturally flows out of these concerns. The divided terrain causes an immediate polarity as we speak of creation care. There is an immediate breakdown of communication when we speak about environmental causes. It gets hijacked. So we need a language of reconciliation first, embedded in the soil of culture, before we can sow seeds of creation care. Further, culture care assumes a stance that is far removed from the we versus them culture wars mentality. St. Paul writes in Epistle to the Galatians, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and self-control." What I offer as culture care is a consideration of the work of the Spirit in culture. In other words, we ask not just how I or you are doing as a follower, individual follower of Christ. We also ask audaciously, how is our culture doing? When one ponders this, it seems clear that for all the talk in the church about being filled with the Spirit, and despite our individual focus on personal spiritual formation, we exhibit very little evidence of such spiritual fruit as the body of Christ and in larger culture. We may argue that we should have these qualities in the church, but cannot expect that to spill over into the world. All right, then I ask, how does the world perceive the church today? Are we filled by the Spirit to them? The world sees us on Sunday morning as the most segregated hour of the week. Instead of exhibiting qualities that Christians understand to be the fruit of the Spirit, Christianity today is seen in the world as exhibiting an outward face of hatred instead of love, fear instead of joy, anxiousness instead of peace, judgmentalism instead of patience, jealous exclusion instead of kindness, narcissism instead of goodness, fear-filled cynicism instead of faithfulness, rage instead of self-control. The world does not see us as being filled with the fruit of the Spirit. See, there is a link between the culture of the church and the culture of the world. The church is supposed to take the lead in providing an oasis of hope, oasis of safety, to be a birthplace for culture and care for the world. Culture care is to reset how the gospel is to be played out in the wider world, to lead, perhaps even from the margins of culture, into the place of shalom. If the church is not birthing culture by making, we will always be on the defensive without the language of generative possibilities. And as I ruminate on these thoughts, it occurs to me that two American writers stand out as giving us maps to navigate this conditional complexity and provide us with a needed language of reconciliation: Emily Dickinson and Rachel Carson. Dickinson's writings stitch their way into the place of longing. Carson's awaken us in the minute particulars of our concern for the sea and the worthiness of culture. Both writers are prophetic in modern times. Both of them gave considerable care to the divides. Both also struggled with that gap between religion and nature, as Wallace Stevens did. But they both point toward to craft a language and world of generative possibilities, the possibilities of the new creation. I am not suggesting that these writers were perfected souls whose lives did not share the same struggles of our mortal souls in our lives, but there are points, even through those flaws, failures, brokenness, toward the new. And such authentic language can heal the divides and bring creation care conversations into culture care, a way to see culture as an abundant ecosystem rather than a limited resource environment, territories to be defend and fight over as in cultural wars of our flesh. Our ears cannot hear anymore because of the bombardment constantly raging in the airwaves. Any talk of environmental stewardship is immediately hijacked by those who claim different political agendas and maybe even be perceived as a threat to industry. So we need a new language of generativity, and these American writers provide us with such a language. There is a garden at Amherst, Massachusetts, that Frederick Olmsted, the designer, master designer of Central Park, visited when he traveled to Amherst, Massachusetts. He knew only that the garden belonged to the son of Edward Dickinson, a noted politician of Amherst. Austin Dickinson, his son, and his family took care of this garden. Olmsted never met the real force behind the renowned garden designs. With her Irish workers, Emily Dickinson spent much time cultivating flowers, especially ones that would survive the cutting. You see that in this New York Botanical Gardens reconstruction of Emily's garden. She raised them so they can survive the cutting to be given away to neighbors in need, with her baked goods that she's known to have won prizes for. Her black cake or coconut cake often came with her flowers and her poems. None of these poems she gave away survive, but the recipes do. At an exhibit at the Poets House in downtown Manhattan, where I used to live, I noticed something very peculiar about the way she wrote her recipes. There's this formal script that she learned well as a groomed young lady of Amherst. Many of her letters come in that formal calligraphy. But her recipes use rather informal writing of playfulness, intimacy, and joy. Now, guess which type of writing she used for her poems. Her poems use the writing style akin to her recipes, not her formal letters. Her poems were recipes for our lives, given away freely to the world. Emily quipped once that the only commandment that she ever obeyed was consider the lilies. An interesting comment, as it is true that Jesus' statement in Matthew 6 is a command. We are not to be anxious about our daily toil, but should trust our Father's gift. To observe nature closely with a poet's eye is to consider the lilies. You consider them as a gardener poet. You till the soil which these bulbs will be planted and buried. You consider them through the harsh winter, through the snow-covered barren days in Amherst, and underneath the ground, cold and darkness set in motion the rooting necessary for these flowers to emerge in the spring. In 1879, she wrote a poem we know today as The Hummingbird. Dickinson rarely put titles, but this one she named at the end. But she named it Humming-Bird. A route of evanescence with a revolving wheel, a resonant of emerald, a rush of cochineal. And every blossom on the bush adjusts its tumbled head. The mail from Tunis, probably an easy morning's ride. This playful poem, whoa, there's an overlap. That's kind of cool. Okay. Is an illumination. The mention of emerald and cochineal burgundy dye extracted from a little Indian beetle, a dye that I use in my work, only reinforced the pictorial quality of her poems. Her mention of Tunis, a North African city, connotes exotic adventure within a place where splendors of the past are hidden and revealed. Because she spent her life almost exclusively in Amherst, Tunis serves more as a mental location than a physical one. Her reference to foreign cities are comparable to Van Gogh's perception of Japan, a foreign place of paradise inaccessible to the artist. There is an Edenic consciousness at work in this poem, but her language even moved beyond Eden, as such a journey is an outward journey toward the future. The route of evanescence of a hummingbird lends such exotic splendor to a mail carrier's ordinary morning ride. This is a good example of how the very structure of Dickinson's writings seemed to visually echo what she saw and observed in nature. The iambic rhythm of these verses, the slant rhymes, wheel, cochineal, head, ride, alternating between verses, and the alliterations, resonance, rush, tumbled, Tunis that weave in and out of her poems like a humming bird seeking nectar. She delicately layers slant rhymes and alliterations. They act as visual devices precisely because they are not fully rhyming. We should note here that the editor of her day offered to publish her poems, but only if she took out the hyphens and dashes, and that they offered assistance to turn her half rhymes into whole ones. She never published again. Hyphens and dashes are unnecessary for information, yes, but to Emily, they represented herself. That unnecessary part was her. There are reasons why she made half rhymes. She was struggling to understand a world that does not rhyme fully. When young boys of Amherst return in coffins with their limbs gone, it does not seem to make sense to keep rhyming whole. We live also in time that does not rhyme fully. There are dire warnings that our earth is depleted and abandoned. In such a time, we need poets to remind us to behold. And so that we can hear ourselves, to remind ourselves why we live. We can live as humming dash birds, which has also been called the miracle bird, as they have to consume in human scale over 150,000 calories a day to survive. How could such creatures exist? In her hesitant rhyme schemes, Emily Dickinson forces us to examine these words visually and see the echoes rather than settle on sounds perfectly aligned. The reader can sense the poet's childlike, playful exuberance as she feels into these words. When she sees the tiny dash of a bird and its many sudden pauses represented in the dash of the title, the fantastic allusion of male from Tunis suggests a sense of anticipation, as if the bird is a letter from an unexpected source, even from a foreign country. Hummingbirds migrate over 500 miles nonstop. We, the readers who know that, are the blossom of the bush, adjusting its tumbled head in anticipation of the arrival of the miraculous. And there are a few hummingbirds in the Audubon show. You should go look. The poem, this poem, is a numinous painting with many layers and colors of overlapping sounds and images and meaning. Emily Dickinson acutely observed a singular momentary event, only seconds long, and she expanded the glimpse of that micro experience into a vast adventure. This is the nature of the poetic gift. The poet takes a quick glance, a moment that most of us would not even see, and expands it to a cosmic level of significance. There is a Eucharistic reality to her words and a longing toward a transport of the spirit into matter, a humble but profound mystery. Another poem by Emily Dickinson. I'm going to couple this with my work, Golden Sea. Those not live yet who doubt to live again. Again is of twice, but this is one. The ship beneath the draw ground, you see. Death, so the hyphen of the sea. Death deep is the schedule of the disk to be, costumeless consciousness, that is he. Hyphens and dashes are liminal, floating about in the structure of this poem, hovering between heaven and earth, between spirit and the material. Hyphens are to poetic expression what poets are to society, a quiet and surprising intrusion, even an agitating pause. tempting society to edit them out for sake of clarity. Yet, fundamentally, it is the most needed pause for us. A sanity in a chaotic survival game called life. Such was the life of Emily Dickinson. She was to become the hyphen of the sea of modern times. She spoke into and even created within a liminal space, in between a forced split between the rational and the intuitive, in between religion and nature. The dash divides and connects the medieval world and our own liquid modernity. She stood outside of the conventional means of success, entered our popular consciousness without needing to resort to the path of acceptance, either by the commodification of her work or by acceptance into the elite literary circles. So when she writes, "Those not live yet, who doubt to live again," her words move in and out of our threshold, planting themselves into the terrains of our darkness, and then elevates us above ground as if to bring us out of a stupor. We are like these tulip bulbs she planted, being warmed by the spring sun. Here the cadence of the poem forces the reader to read the first, you might have noticed, live as live. Because if you read it, live as in conventional ways, the first line, those not live yet, you break up the rhythm. So you're forced to add the A, those not alive yet, those not live yet. And the second stanza conventionally would read, who doubt to live again. You can keep the rhythm there. What we have is a visual rhyme, accentuated by the repetition, both literally and figuratively, of themes reinforced by the word that starts with A's. Those not live yet, who doubt to live again. Again is of a twice. A is repeated, forced, and there's this, you have to notice now the invisible A in the first line. That is the significant marker for a reading of the whole poem. She is forcing us to pay attention, to give way to the smallest, even invisible of the details. She's making us aware of what being alive means. That it is more than live. It means to be alive. She's teaching us to behold. Young men of Amherst who came back in coffins. They are like the ships that never left the harbor. Youth whose lives are never allowed to become alive. Alive in order to see the fulfillment of their potential. Without the A, we are merely live, incomplete, and never alive. But again, without the A, is also a gain. A play on the same principle, but giving a fresh meaning into what gain really is. What are we gaining? What is she talking about? Why would she hide this in the poem? She's speaking of the promise of the resurrection, in which life is taken up in death to be with God, but then reunited with the body when heaven and earth will be fused. The hyphens, therefore, lead into the new creation. Again is of twice, is a profound repetition of the promise of the Bible, prompting the good Bishop N.T. Wright to speak of the mystery of the resurrection as the life after death. For Dickinson, such promise is fully understood not just from the perspective of faith, but also of doubt, who doubt to live again. And such mental vacillation makes her hard to pin down ideologically or theologically. Some have suggested her poems have a Buddhistic tone of reincarnation, but rather than see this as a circular pattern of reincarnation, it's more accurate to read her words as a sacramental movement, an upward vortex toward a new creation. It makes sense then that beyond the hyphen of the sea belies the costumeless consciousness, the disk to be. Like the circadian rhythm of nature or the tide of the ocean going in and out, the rhythm of life or death takes on the mystery in the depth of time. Disk here, as it can be, as has been noticed by many, can also be sun or moon on their regular courses, appearing and reappearing in its death and life. But visually speaking, a disk is a halo of angels and saints whose costumeless consciousness bows beyond the veil. Here the words offer alternative pronunciations again. Schedule can be pronounced as I did, schedule, echoing then a forced alliteration into costumeless consciousness. The rhyme of the words read and the nuance of the sound create a gentle wave of the sea, a lullaby for our age of doubt. In this poem, she calls death dash, so, dash, hyphen of the sea, dash. The very presence of the word hyphen she suspends between dashes. Like the names of the dead, they're caught between reality and imagination, between life and death, between clarity and ambiguity. And while they are to make the reader pause or break the flow of words, they are also there to create another form of visual imagery. These dashes, are stitches weaving in and out of her liquid words, her gentle but aggressive operation on the diseased body of industry and war. Sutures to close the wounds of the incisions made into a dehumanized, torn world. If death is indeed a hyphen of the sea of life, a pause between the appearance of our costumeless consciousness, then what does the dashes themselves signify? To her, the dash was the most idiosyncratic visage of a poet, her most enduring creation. To me, Dickinson's hyphens point us toward a new creation. And Rachel Carson. One way to open our eyes is to ask yourself, what if I had never seen this before? What if I knew I would never see it again? The etchings of passenger pigeons and Carolina parrots at the Audubon show. What if I would never see it again? A single mother of creation care, I call her. If Emily Dickinson found her solitude in her bedroom in Amherst, Rachel Carson's solitary journey as a woman began as a marine biologist who needed to take care of her family, her aging parents, and later her ill sister and her sister's child, who Carson would eventually adopt. But a bureaucratic job in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Office in Baltimore gave her an opportunity to write down what she was observing. If Dickinson considered the lilies, Carson considered the ocean with care-filled scientific precision. Her observations about the sea did not seem prophetic at the time, or remotely dangerous to the status quo. But her words changed the world. I believe that her words are just as powerful, just as prophetic as Dr. Martin King Jr.'s speeches. She dreamt of a world in which we neither take nature as our adversary nor take nature's gift for granted. We must recall that when she began to write, creation care or even the word environmentalism was not even a footnote. There was no concept or language of protecting the environment. Man was to win against nature, and there was no place for a woman to write against such inevitable dominion. If you watch Terrence Malick's Tree of Life over and over, as I have, you saw the children in the streets of this city, Waco, Texas, dancing about while being sprayed by clouds of DDT. DDT saved lives from malaria, and it needed now to take over the streets of Waco. And chemical companies are to make money by providing such a benefit to society. But Carson saw a sinister shadow. She began to collect data on the effect of man-made chemicals on the environment. Before long, she was writing against some of the most powerful industrial forces of chemical companies, while feeding her family by herself, and later battling her own breast cancer. Before she wrote that manifesto, which literally reshaped our environmental activism, Silent Spring, she wrote another book, a masterpiece of precise, exquisite sentences. So here, a paragraph from the sea around us. The activities of the microscopic vegetables of the sea, of which the diatoms are the most important, make the mineral wealth of the water available to the animals. Feeding directly on the diatoms and other groups of minute unicellular algae are the marine protozoa, many crustaceans, the younger crabs, barnacles, sea worms, and fishes, hordes of small carnivores. The first link in the chain of flesh eaters move among these peaceful grazers. They are fierce little dragons, half an inch long, the sharp-jawed arrowworms. There are gooseberry-like comb jellies armed with grasping tentacles, and there are the shrimp-like euphausiids that straw food from the water with their bristly appendages. Since they drift where the currents carry them, with no power or will to oppose that of the sea, this strange community of creatures and the marine plants that sustain them are called planktons, a word driven from the Greek, meaning wandering. I read these descriptions of the minutiae of the sea and found myself deeply moved. I just asked myself why. How could a series of objective details of the ocean move me so much? Then I began to notice what literature's professors call chiasmus, built into this paragraph. It hinges on this word, small, on small carnival at the middle of the paragraph. Everything in this paragraph hinges on the word small. How can you tell? Try removing that word and the connected words, and the entire paragraph falls apart. Hordes of carnivores does not have the power of the juxtaposition of contrast that the expression hordes of small carnivores carries. Notice then how this one word small is echoed and amplified throughout the paragraph. Microscopic vegetables, diatoms, minute unicellular algae, fierce little dragons. And the paragraph concludes with a stunning sentence, a shifting tide of rhythm. since they drift where the currents carry them with no power or will to oppose that of the sea. This strange community of creatures and marine plants that sustain them are called plankton, a word driven from the Greek, meaning wandering. Carson is not just describing the ocean and its inhabitants. She is seeing in the wandering plankton her own soul. Just as much as Emily Dickinson saw herself in the dashes and hyphens, Carson saw herself to be small. She wrote a sentence that completely depends on the adjectives. That's the point, because she felt like an adjective, an addendum, powerless in a world in which such tender care to the minute particulars would be a nuisance dismissed by the powerful. And yet, in the strange community of creatures represented by the plankton, she identifies the invisible power of nature. The vertical linear descriptors that echo the word small create this empathetic chorus that sings with her and enlists us to join the choir. The words do not just accurately inform us of the ocean, they are an invitation, they are an invocation, and even a benediction to invite us to the feast. I used to assume that culture care is a natural extension of creation care, that writers like Rachel Carson would lead the way by transitioning from ecological concerns to caring for culture at large. But then I realized that such care has to find its voice in words woven carefully before we begin to talk about the creation. Creation care, as I said, can easily be hijacked by culture wars, polarization. So to write well is to create an antidote to our divisive language and culture. The arts can provide the antidote for our polarized culture and prevent them to be conscripted into skirmishes of culture wars front lines. In Carson's writings, there is culture care before there is creation care. An artist can be a prophetic, poetic, healing voice, but the words of transgression can serve also, if you're not careful, for predetermined ideologies. These words are carefully drawn, therefore, and Carson's and Dickinson's provide us a map toward creation care. Carson fulfills Dickinson's dashes and hyphens and fills them with small wonders. Her words cascade in a collective awe, and at the end of the paragraph, we too are wondering, plankton, in the ocean full of life and mystery. Small carnivores and dashes. That these two women writers had this much impact speaks of the power of words. Perhaps one can say the power of dashes and adjectives. To write well is to tap into such a surprising source of the power of the new. The new is generative and moves beyond status quo and sustainability. There's a particular word that is used when the New Testament writers speak of the new, as in 2 Corinthians 5:17. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he or she is a new creation. The old has passed, behold, the new has come. The Greek word here is kainos. I define kainos to be newness. It's akin to a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. Yes, it is transformation, but it's more than that. It's transfiguration. The Greek word there is metamorpho, a word Paul used so often translated as transformation, but it's really transfiguration. I may even go further and say that kainos is not just a new species, but a new concept of what a new species is. When I speak of generativity, I am speaking of the potential that each one of us, even in our ordinary days, to attain this newness in us. I believe such potential is often found in the margins, works of art in human experiences, in the dashes, in the liminal, in the minute creatures, in the gratuitous, in the discarded, in the exiled voices. Here's a pear tree in my backyard. All artists seek the new. Great ones redefine what newness is. You see, before Rachel Carson, there was no language for creation care. Before Emily Dickinson, no one dared to write over 1,800 poems and hide them in neatly stitched fascicles and bury them underneath her bed. What it means to observe, to capture, to behold, what it means to long for a world restored and made new. What it means to hide such precious collection. Such is the effort of poets and artists. Carson and Dickinson gave us this newness and opened up the possibility of a future discourse that we can have for a world that is fundamentally different from what we see. Fundamentally different. A world in which our worth is defined and not limited to industrial pragmatism. Stewardship of creation needs to be led by poets, writers, musicians, dancers, directors, artists, and architects. They are the catalyst of this spiritual growth of the new. Rachel Carson said this: I am not afraid of being thought a sentimentalist when I stand here tonight and tell you that I believe natural beauty has a necessary place in the spiritual development of any individual or any society. I believe that whenever we destroy beauty, or whenever we substitute something man-made and artificial for a natural future of the earth, we have retarded some part of man's spiritual growth. We live in a day and age in which preachers no longer speak of the new. They speak of fixing the world, or they speak of the apocalyptic end instead of the new. When industries no longer can define us or our work, or can no longer define our communities, when the luminaries of our time believe in this singularity that will reduce us to machines, when we ignore the pauses, the silences in between, the hyphens and dashes, when we can segment our data to reproduce human speech, when we ignore the prosaic in our complexity of our beings, reductivism will always shortchange us to be less on our full potential. The abundant diversity of creation is a celebration. It is a dance. It is the highest realm of God's theater. But in order to celebrate, we need first a language of abundance and delight. We need a feast of love, of joy, of peace, of patience, of kindness, of goodness, of faithfulness, and of self-control. Culture care language injects such possibilities and will help in ushering in creation care. The hyphens and dashes that editors took out in Dickinson's poems articulate for us the path of the unnecessary, of the exuberant, of the extravagant abundance in which small carnivores can thrive under the watchful delight of Carson, and they lead us into the delight of creation and the feast of new creation. Thank you.